Recording in
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Project Trust webinar entitled Integrating the Wisdom of Lived Experience and Delivering Trauma-Informed Services. Project Trust is a national collaboration between the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, the Sinar Institute, and Brandeis University. The goal of this project is to deliver trauma-informed training and technical assistance to anti-trafficking organizations across the country. It is a federally funded program by the Office of Victims of Crime. Welcome to this training today. The first thing we'd like to do before getting started is to inform you all about our training working agreement. We want to make sure that this is a safe space, especially since we are talking about survivor and lived experience inclusion. We want to make sure that everyone has a safe space to ask questions and to work with the colleagues who are here today to identify the best approaches to working with this very important demographic in the anti-trafficking field. If you have questions or want to share comments, please use the chat feature in the Zoom. And if you are asking questions that you'd like one of our panelists to answer, please submit your questions through the Q&A option, which we will have about 10 to 15 minutes to answer questions at the very end of today's webinar. So some quick tips before we get started. We are going to be talking about something that might hit home for some of us. So if you need to, remember to take care of yourself during this time. Feel free to step outside to take a break. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on the Project Trust website in about a week if you do miss anything while you're taking a short break. Feel free to use any self-care sensory items to fidget with while you are paying attention and absorbing this information. And feel free to take some time after today's webinar to cultivate kindness towards yourself and others on your team by really taking some time to focus on what we talked about today and thinking about how you might want to integrate some of these tips and tricks. So today in our webinar, we're trying to achieve a few things. First, we are going to identify best practices in service delivery through a lived experience lens. We will also explore implementation of best practices in direct service settings. And finally, we will highlight the integration of meaningful survivor leadership. Today, our subject matter experts are as follows. My name is Naja Martin, and I am the Thrive Initiative's Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator at the SNAD Institute. I work hand in hand with Project Trust to deliver these trauma-informed trainings. We also have Christian Eduardo, Ashante Taylor-Cox, and Laura Powers. I will allow each person to introduce themselves. First, Christian.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and taking the time to join this conversation about delivering services and how to be better inclusive when we are talking about people with lived experience or survivors. My name is Christian Eduardo. I am an immigrant from Mexico. I am a survivor of international domestic sex and labor trafficking. I am a person living with HIV, and I am a consultant on human trafficking. My work is focused on policy legislation and make sure that service providers have trauma-informed and victim-centered approaches to work with the communities that are serving. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Next, we have Ashante Taylor-Cox.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashante. I am a licensed associate counselor here in the state of New Jersey and the founder and executive director of a nonprofit organization called You Are More Than. We are a survivor-led org focused on uplifting survivors of trafficking and exploitation. And I'm really excited to be here today.
Thank you, Ashante. And lastly, we have Laura Powers.
Thanks, Naja. So I'm Laura. I've been working in the field for about 10 years now, and was working on the National Human Trafficking Hotline when I came out as a survivor, and I had been working at that point, I think it was about 4 years in. And I was shocked by how suddenly my relationships and how I was treated changed by others, by stakeholders in the field. So not necessarily my colleagues, but the people that would generally call on me to be an expert on a panel suddenly just wanted to know my story. And so I took a step back, and this was also the time I started connecting with other survivors of trafficking and realized that my experience was not the exception, but actually the norm. And so I threw myself heavily into the survivor empowerment and leadership space. And I'm very grateful to be here today with you all.
Thank you so much, Laura. So before we get into the content of this webinar, we wanted to highlight the helpfulness of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's principles of a trauma-informed approach to care when wanting to incorporate survivor leadership and lived experience lens into your organizational practices. SAMHSA's principles of a trauma-informed approach to care include safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. These principles provide a helpful framework for survivor and lived experience inclusion, and we will briefly highlight some of these principles throughout the webinar. We will now define what it means to be a survivor-informed and to be a survivor-informed organization and highlight a few key considerations. Ashante Taylor-Cox will lead us through these next few slides.
Yes. So when we think about defining survivor-informed, we look at practices acknowledging the unique perspectives of survivors with relevant expertise based on their knowledge of their trafficking experiences and challenges that they faced in order to rebuild their lives. A survivor-informed practice includes meaningful input from a diverse community of survivors at all stages of program or project, including development, implementation, and evaluation. Sometimes community members can see survivor-informed practices as one entity, and throughout this presentation, I want you to think about it as you want us to be a part of everything. You want us to be a part of every aspect of your programming in your organization. Next slide, please. And, a lot of times I want you to think about moving beyond good intentions. So we can have good intentions about something and not really think about the impact that that intention may have on a survivor leader. So throughout this presentation, I want you to think that your intentions is what you had in mind when setting a goal or you decided to perform an action. And it may reflect what type of impact you want to create, but you're not really thinking long-term about what kind of impact it will result in. So move beyond good intentions and focus on, if this action were to be implemented, what impact would this have on the community? And will it be a good impact? Next slide, please. And when we think about survivor leadership, it's really important to think about the value. Why do we need survivor leadership? So Rachel Lloyd, the founder and executive director of GEMS in New York City, speaks about survivor-led services and says, survivor-led services strive to incorporate the voice of survivors, ensuring that development and implementation of programming is driven by their experience and expertise. By having survivor leadership within your organization, you have relatability. Survivors are able to relate to the service providers in your agency. You have the ability to model a hopeful future. If I'm able to see another survivor thriving in a role that I think would be great for me, or in general, thriving after leaving the life, that feels empowering for me. And a lot of times it supports in mitigating power issues of having a survivor know that the person sitting across from me is not someone who's trying to take advantage of me, not someone who is trying to harm me in any way, but they know where I've been and are willing to meet me where I'm at. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Ashante, for setting up this webinar. Now we'll pass it over to Christian Eduardo, who will take us through part 1 of this webinar, identifying best practices in service delivery with a lived experience lens.
Great. I think that we need to really start understanding identity and how this intersect with literally everything. There's a tendency to assume that when we talk about human trafficking, it's only a separated entity. When we talk about survivors, that all of them self-identify openly as a survivors or people with lived experience. And a lot of times we minimize all the other things. Are they immigrants? Are they people of colors? Are they women, kids? How long their trafficking situation has been impacted them or impact them? And this is very, very important because when we are trying to deliver services with a lived experience lens, we need to remember that probably our coworkers, the people in our teams, the people that we are working with, they can be survivors. So we need to understand not only how culture, history, trauma, gender, and sexuality can impact our clients or the people that we are serving, but also how this is impacting all the people around us. And this is extremely important with me. I remember that when I was out of my trafficking experience, I was looking for help as an immigrant, as a gay man, not really having fluency in English. And most of the spaces that I was looking for help, they weren't culturally inclusive. I was like very afraid of, because I didn't know if they were working with immigrants or not before, even like disclosing being part of the LGBT community, it was a huge thing for me because there was no way for me to know that all these agencies, organizations, or even the service providers, the ones that were doing the intake and trying to find help and support for me, they weren't covering all this. Their approaches were totally different. And this has a huge impact. It's not only understanding, but this is going to impact how the bond and trust is created with our clients. If we don't know the communities that we are serving, if we don't know their story, if we don't know like how our privilege can impact our interaction with them, we are not going to be able to give them the services that they deserve. And that was happened to me. A lot of times I didn't receive the services that I need. And when I'm talking about intersectionality, really think about, this is very common and I have heard this when I'm training nonprofit service providers. Have you ever worked with someone from the LGBTQ plus community? And a lot of them answer no. That answer creates me a lot of worry because actually the question is, why they never share with you that they were probably part of the LGBT community? The same happen every time. I think that because we are not addressing this intersectionality, including gender and sexuality, we tend to assume that we are not serving a specific communities. We isolated them and we think that we are doing great when in reality, we are denying services to a lot of our communities that are being impacted by human trafficking. Next. Self-identification, and I touched a little bit about this before. There's an assumption that survivors are the only one survivors are the one who self-identify openly or that share their experience openly, and that is not true. A lot of times when we are really trying to deliver services that are inclusive, when we understand intersectionality, we need to understand that the people that we are working around, probably they are survivors themselves. Probably they were victims themselves. Probably they identify, but not in the workspace. Why? Because it was very interesting that Lara was sharing how the narrative changed when people were looking first and reaching out to her as an expert, but when they knew that she was a survivor, it was happening the opposite. And that's a clear example of self-identification. A lot of times, our work teams, the people that we are working alongside, they don't want to disclosure because there is the idea that people with lived experience, survivors and victims, they are weak, that their only value is around what they experience and is the only way that they can contribute. So I'm really making the call for all the people here to not only assume that. I think that we really need to break, and I have seen this tendency all around the country, but there are still a lot of stigma, misinformation about what is the meaning of survivor-led, survivor inclusivity. And hopefully today we can not only challenge that, but start changing it. And self-identification also includes how we are doing the intakes, the language that we are using, and a lot of times we jump to conclusions. I remember that when I was receiving all these intakes, there were a lot of invasive questions. Have you ever interchanged sex for something of value? And there was no explanation before it. And I think that a lot of times, because we are not being inclusive, because we are not setting boundaries, and because we are not defining roles, that we cannot access that information. We don't create that trust. So it's very important to not label the people that we are interacting to. I think that a lot of times, because we have been on the field for so long, we forget what people doesn't know that we know. And this is very, very common. I think that when we are doing intakes, when we have new clients, it's just understanding that they are human beings, that if they are there with you, if they are right with you, it's because they are looking for help and support, not to being told who they are, not to being labeled about their experiences, and not to being decide what is happening in their future. Next. Collaboration and mutuality. I think that this is a little bit tricky because a lot of times service providers are the one who are giving services, as the one who know where are the support system, where can you access this thing. We assume that we know best than our clients. We assume that we know what is better for them. And this is probably something that is impacting us because of vicarious trauma, because of this savior complex that I have seen a lot. No one can know better than me. I am the one who is going to rescue you. I am the one who is going to help you. I am the hero. And we need to change that approach. We are here to walk alongside our clients. We are here to collaborate together. And we are really here to identify their needs, work with them. And there's another thing that a lot of times we don't think about. Probably we're modeling the first time that healthy relationship, how they look like. So it's very, very important to define roles. I am your lawyer, I am your caseworker. What I'm going to do next? Why am I asking you these questions? Why are we meeting? There are things that I can do. There are things that I cannot do. And this is very, very important to do, because this is acknowledging the power that we have in the room, how our interactions with clients. The reality is that I think that all that we are service providers, we want to be friends with our clients. We want to do our best for our clients. But this has potential negative impact, because a lot of times if we don't set those boundaries, our clients are going to rely 100% on us. And that's not the idea, because at the end, we can be mirroring a lot of abuse and violence that we as survivors, we have suffered. So it's very, very important to share the information. Why am I doing this? What is the goal of this? Why am I asking you this? What are the next steps? What can I do and what can I do? These are the things that I cannot do, but here, there are referrals. I'm here to support you. Do you want me to go with you? I remember that a lot of times the service providers that they were giving me services, they were just literally giving me a paper with a number. That was so unhelpful. That was so I don't care about you. And in my mind, because they never defined the role, it was like, I thought that you were here to help me. So I think that it's a must to define the role. It's a must to define what am I able to do and what I cannot do. So it's very, very important, like to set those boundaries. And I think that it's very hard a lot of times, because the reality is that we don't want our clients, the people that we are offering services to, like to continue suffering or going through all these barriers. We want the best for them, but we are going to achieve this if we work together and alongside them. It's very, very important. Again, please define the role. I think that it's very, very important to respect boundaries. One thing that I could say is that ask what time is best for you to communicate, and set those boundaries also for yourself. I know that you're in need. I know that I'm working here, but maybe after 8 p.m., don't expect any answer from me. I'm going to answer the next day. The first time that I'm going to do is like check my email, my phone, like to check if there's any update from you. But because a lot of times that happens when you don't define the roles as service providers, for the lens of the people who are experiencing human trafficking or any form of abuse, we feel that you left us alone because you never defined your role. Next. Share leadership. And this is very, very connected with collaboration and mutuality. A lot of times we just decide for our clients, this is what you can do. And we are not there for that. We are there to create a path to make them choose. I remember that I interact with a lot of organizations, legal, health, immigration, and a lot of them, they were literally just telling me what to do. And in reality, they never care about how they were sharing this. They never care how I was feeling, how they were taking out of the power and control in the room, and how I was feeling like really re-exploited again, because I was never given like any option. What do I really wanted? And it was very interesting because the first time that I heard and a service provider make me feel like a human again, it was when the person who helped me with my legal and immigration burden and issues, instead of asking me, what is your story? What are you here for? These are the services that we have. This person asked me, are you hungry? Do you want water? Are you feeling comfortable? And that was the first time probably in years that I felt heard, that I felt like a human again. And I think that there are these small things I'm always telling like all the service providers and all the people that I'm training, like, remember that the clients that we are serving, they are human beings. I know that we can have maybe a lot of cases. I know that we all have experienced trauma in different ways in our lives, but remember that why we are here. Remember that our clients are human beings and they are there not because they want to be, it's because they need support. They need like this approach and something remembering them that we are all human beings. So recognize your privilege. And when I'm saying recognize your privilege, a lot of times, especially if you're a male and you're a service provider, ask your client, are you comfortable with me and you alone in this room? Is there something that I can do to make you feel comfortable? Because as a male myself, I have seen how in a lot of spaces, just my presence can be triggering. So I'm always asking people around, I know that I'm a male, I know that I'm perceived as a male by society. So is there something that I can do to make the people feel comfortable? It's very, very important. I think that this is very real. And also, I think that this can also apply if you identify as a female, because unless we know the story of the client that we are serving, we don't know who abused them. We don't know what happened. So we need to recognize that. And a lot of times I think that lawyers or in general, like professionals, it can be the doctor, it can be the caseworker. There's a huge gap in education in between the service provider and the client. There's a huge gap around like gender education, sexuality, how to be inclusive. And this is translated in not creating the bond. It's really translated in not connecting with your client. So it's very, very important. Share decision-making, delegate and ask. And it's again, all these micro activities, they can seem and be feel like as abuse again. Oh, you know, this person is not giving me the power to decide. This person is deciding for me. This person doesn't care about my pronouns. This person doesn't care about how I identify myself. This person doesn't care how I feel, well, how they move, their tone of voice. Like, so let's be very mindful about this. Let's share like the power and control in the room. And it's very, very important. Recognize triggers. I think that we always focus only on the client. It's very important to recognize our trigger. Don't wait until things are coming out of control. Even if you need a space, if you need a time, like tell your client, do you want water? Can you give me a minute? Like, I'm going for water. Can we take a break? Not only for them, but only for you. Next. Individual approach. I think that a lot of times we have been there. I know what's happening. I know what this person is experiencing. I know all the resources. Never assume absolutely anything. We have experience. We have dealt with different cases. Probably we have had different people from different communities. Every single experience is different. Yes, we can identify major areas, but we need to have an individual approach. Not because someone with the same characteristic belonging to the same community, it's going to need the same support. It's going to need the same services. It's going to need the same approach. Always, what do you need? What can we do together to fulfill your needs? How can I support you? How do you want to communicate? This is very important. When I was receiving services, I was having a lot of problems receiving phone calls. All my service providers wanted to me calling me, schedule the next meeting, what was happening about my case, what were the next steps. And it was so traumatizing, to be honest, because I know that I need to answer the phone. So now I'm feeling the pressure. I feel that they are just forcing me to do things. Always ask, how do you want to communicate? Email, text messages, phone calls, what time is better for you? And feel free also, again, boundaries are really important. If I'm communicating with my client through WhatsApp, don't expect from me like an answer after 6 p.m., 7 p.m., 8 p.m. Don't expect from me an answer from 7 a.m. If it's through phone calls, please don't call me before this time or after that time. It's very, very important to set up like healthy boundaries, be open about this, and just communicate with your clients. Always have this individual approach. We are all human beings and we experience life in a very different way. So always ask, like never assume anything. Next slide. So what can we do better as individuals? Be aware of our trauma and triggers, vicarious trauma, and how our cultural, our background, even how we identify ourselves. Service providers and stakeholders address vicarious trauma, not only as an individual, but as an organization, and this applies for both service providers and organization. Even if you cannot address it directly, make sure that your staff have access to mental health, that your staff is being trained about gender, sexuality, the LGBT community. Know the community that you are serving. If you fail your staff, as a consequence, you are going to fail all your clients. You are going to fail survivors. You are going to fail all the people who live experience. Our clients, victims, survivors, and people who live experience are human beings. And every single person that is attending this webinar, you are also a human being. So have that self-compassion also for, not only for your clients, that compassion, but for yourself. And for organizations, for all those who are supervisors, make sure that you are giving supervision, that it's trauma informed, that you are asking your clients, that you're working as a team. A lot of times cases around human trafficking are very complex. So we need to work as a team, recognize vicarious trauma, always ask. Healing, it's also part of our path as all human beings, because vicarious trauma is very real. We need to acknowledge it, prevent it, and intervene in case that is affecting ourselves as individual, as an organization. In this way, we're going to provide better resources and services for all individuals, our clients, and all those with lived experience. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Christian. That was incredibly helpful and informative. Now we are going to turn it over to Ashante Taylor-Cox, who will be taking us through part 2 of this webinar, where we will be exploring implementation of best practices in direct service settings.
Thank you. All right. So assessment of programs, why is it so important? Being able to assess your programming and your organization as a whole is really instrumental in creating an organization that will not only support the community that you're serving, but it'll help you grow. You need to be able to assess your program so that each year, every survivor that may come through your doors will be different. You need to assess so that you can help yourself grow, help your community grow, help your staff grow. And we're going to look at different ways of how to assess your programming. Next slide, please. So I broke down assessment into 5 categories, and it's not all inclusive. We can add more questions to this, but looking at number 1, how many staff members in your agency are survivors? And you know, this may be hard to gauge because a lot of times survivors will not self-disclose, and that is okay. But how are you making the roles within your agency accessible to survivors? When you have your job description up on Indeed, are you putting at the bottom, we are inclusive of survivor leaders applying for this role, or however you want to word that? We are very open to individuals with lived experiences. How are you making sure that your job descriptions and your jobs that you're employing are reaching the survivor community? And are there forms of diverse backgrounds of survivorship? Are there different forms of trafficking? Are you including LGBTQ voices, BIPOC, domestic and foreign nationals? One time I went for a job interview a couple years ago, and I went through multiple interviews with this agency. And when I got to like the 3rd interview, they said, oh, I'm a familiar trafficking survivor. So they said, oh, how will you relate to the survivors that we're serving? Because everyone is a pimp controlled trafficking survivor. And it was the most uncomfortable position for me to be in, because it was like my experiences of trafficking were completely ignored. And it was very awkward and hard to justify how trafficking experiences can look different across the board, and that like I would do well in that position. So thinking about, am I hiring a diverse background of survivors? And then of the survivors that you potentially know about within your agency, how many are actually in leadership roles? At my organization, when it comes to our board members, 50% are survivors, 50% are allies. And in the next 3 years, as we grow, 80% of our staff will be survivor leaders and 20% will be allies. Why am I intentional about that? Because I want the community to reflect the people that we are serving. And it is imperative that you are conscious about these decisions, because that is how your organization is going to grow. And leadership roles can look different across the board. It can be managers, executive team, board of directors, volunteer manager. It can look different across the board, but making sure, are you putting survivors in leadership roles, key roles where individuals can make decisions that will affect people underneath them? If there are no survivors on staff, how does the agency incorporate their feedback? Are there survivors contributing to the agency in other ways? Do you have a large team of consultants that are survivor leaders? Do you have a large group of volunteers that are survivor leaders? Now, I put volunteers in there because a lot of times survivors will say, oh, I'll volunteer for your organization. But as a rule of thumb, you always want to compensate survivors, especially if you're asking us to share our trauma narratives, especially if you're asking us to develop curriculum or evaluate curriculum or come to an event where you're raising money. You always want to compensate survivors. That should never be a, oh, should we do this or should we give them a muffin basket, which has happened in the past. They should be valued for their expertise. Our lived experiences are expertise, and we should be valued for those through compensation. And then looking at what are the barriers to making the agency survivor informed? Do we hold as individuals or as an agency biases about the survivor community that are difficult for us to see them in leadership roles or in employment roles within our agency? And how does these biases limit the potential of the survivors we work with? Because if you're not able to see survivors in employment roles in your agencies or leadership roles in your agencies, how are you seeing community members? Are you able, I did a training once in Portland, and one of the individuals who was very passionate about the work made a comment about, well, how can my survivor that I'm serving go to law school when she doesn't even go to school? Like, I tell her all the time, you're not going to be able to go to law school because you don't even like school. And it's like, it's our job to empower them and believe that they can do it and meet them where they're at, even if today they're not going to school, and not be the voice in the back of their head that says, well, you're not going to make it because you're not showing me your full potential at this time. So thinking about what are the barriers to making the agency survivor informed? And then how does the agency take the input from survivors and folks with lived experience to uplift the agency? And this is specifically looking at client-facing staff. How are you taking the input from your staff members in consideration of the work that you're doing? And when they're giving you feedback, if it is impacting your staff in some way, like the programming that you have, maybe you have a policy where you're available 24/7. How is that impacting your client-facing staff? Are you having regular conversations with your direct service staff? And are you implementing policies and practices that protect your direct service staff so that they feel more supported? Because again, many of the individuals that you serve may also identify as survivors while they are your employees. And we have high turnover rate in organizations. It's because we're not taking care of our staff members just as well as we're taking care of the community. Next slide. Najee, you can hit next slide. Just technical difficulties, guys. 1 second. Okay, awesome. All right. So further on, looking at assessing, how does your agency incorporate community feedback? So from the people that you directly serve, how are you incorporating their feedback about your programming? It is helpful to assess how the community feels before entering your programming, during your programming, and after services in order to help the program grow. If negative feedback is given, how is this handled? Is that feedback able to be used constructively to identify where the agency falls short? Or are you just putting it in a community feedback box and never looking at that box? Where and how do clients get a say in the support that they receive? Clients should be a part of every single aspect of their treatment throughout their time at your agency. From the moment that they enter your doors and agree to services to the moment that they leave your services. They should be a part of every single aspect. Recently, I was on a case management call for a survivor throughout our program, and none of the emails included the survivor. Why? And instantly was like, hey guys, new to the team, we're going to include the survivor in this communication. If we're talking about their lives and making decisions with them, they should be a part of this email chain. And that may seem like a simple thing, but it's something that can be very imperative in the survivor feeling like, one, we're eliminating that power dynamic where we're the people making decisions for them rather than us walking alongside them and making decisions. And two, allowing them to see this is the thought process of what's happening with the team that's supporting me. And then what are the barriers to including the community's feedback in the work? Have there been difficult experiences in the past when incorporating the community into the work? And if so, how did you handle them? What about the situation made it difficult? And what is something that you can do different in the future to help with that? And then if there is a lack of resources that community that you serve needs, how does the agency address those missing pieces? Many agencies lack survivor leaders, LGBTQ individuals, bilingual individuals, individuals with disabilities as staff members. How do we change that? YAMT is the first Black-led, survivor-led, and queer-led organization here in the state of New Jersey. And there are not a lot of faces that when I look around at organizations that look like me or have identities like me. There needs to be more progress in that area so that survivors in the community can see what we can grow to, what we can accomplish, how we can make a difference, especially within the anti-trafficking community. Next slide. Okay, so I'm gonna, okay, one moment, everyone. While we're waiting for Naja to come back, it would be helpful if you typed in the chat box, what are some barriers that you find are difficult for you to assess your organization's stance on including survivors or folks with lived experience within your work? What are some barriers that you face? And in my next slides, I'll talk about some tips for how you can continue with assessment. Yes.
Hello, everyone. It seems that we are having some technical difficulties. Thank you so much for holding up with us.